So yeah, my name is Gareth Mulvenna, and the book you were looking for is Tartan Gangs and Paramilitaries, which I always keep handy. But we're here today to talk about the book myself and Billy co-wrote, My Life in Loyalism, which is Billy's story. So basically, I'm a sort of historian of the Troubles, fascinated by the period, and I've got a particular interest in oral history and how we capture people's stories from that period and preserve them for future generations. So basically the format of this will be, as Stephen said, I'll have a sort of informal conversation with Billy, a sort of interview light type thing, and then we'll look at some wider themes and then open it to questions. So basically, the most obvious place to start is if I can ask Billy, why did you want to write the book, and what motivated you to tell your story at this point in time?
Well, Gareth, I suppose the reason why I wanted to do it was that there aren't very many books that have been written about loyalism, and if they have, they tend to be sensationalized and also tend to be incorrect in a lot of them. And I'm talking about people like journalists and people who wrote them. They took whatever evidence was in the court and whatever was in the papers and just writes it up, and you don't get a feel for it. So the other thing was that I was continually saying to people, that you need to write and you need to be making sure that you have a narrative that actually goes along. Otherwise, somebody else will write the narrative for you and it'll be wrong. So from that point of view, that was the reason why I wanted to write the book. And from my point of view, the reason why I chose My Loyalist Life was about actually describing what actually happened. And I tried to be as truthful as I could. And that was one of the ways of doing it. And it was never a book about Troubles per se. For that very reason, it was just about the things that I had known about or had been involved in, and that's what I talked about.
Yeah, so I suppose to go back to the start, you were born in December 1955. So can you talk a wee bit for people who might not know, what was it like growing up in the Shankill as a boy in the 1960s period before, the Troubles really started to intensify?
Well, I suppose growing up in the Shankill in the 1960s, it was, I suppose in many ways, it was perceived as the heart of the empire. And, I know, and everybody else will know, that the empire was starting to disappear in the 60s, but unionism didn't move along with it. I also think that whether you lived in the Falls of the Shankill, you were discriminated against. It was people who were discriminated against. And, people living in the Shankill and the Falls at that time would have been living in poverty in the main. And I think there was a unionist government, and that unionist government was treating working class people the same. And I think there was a camaraderie, I think, in the Shankill that was around the whole notion of Britishness, and people around the summer, particularly the 12th, had street parties, did arches, all of that sort of stuff. But and sort of like, how would I describe it? Commemorated sort of their Britishness and stuff about loyalism as well, and all that was done. So, stories were told about the conflicts around the world, and obviously the famous story that was told was about the Somme and the sacrifice of the Somme and stuff like that, and also the creation of the state in 1921, which we're now 100 years at. So that's how it was, and there was a lot of camaraderie around then, and for me, growing up then, what I remember is that there was a sense of belonging in the community, and people sort of helped each other. And from my point of view, and people my age will know this, so if Peggy McConnell lived 2 doors from us, we weren't allowed to call her Peggy, we had to call her Mrs. Or if Billy McConnell, we weren't allowed to call him Billy, we had to call him Mr. And you had all of that. So it was that sort of like, way of life. People respected that, and if I was going to a door to get somebody who I was friendly with and we were going out to play, somebody would have had a pot of stew on or a pot of soup, and they'd invited you in if it was time to eat and said, look, do you want to come and eat with us? So it was that sort of stuff, and it was a good sense of belonging in a sense, and a good sense of community. But obviously it had all its problems as well in terms of what was going on, and particularly about division and stuff like that. But it was there, and that's what it was.
I suppose the two interesting things when you look at the 1960s and about the experiences of people on the Shankill in particular. You talk about it as being the heart of the empire. People felt that was, but it was the end of the empire, really. And I think one thing that, we talked about, one of the best anecdotes that you talked about in the book was Gusty Spence talking to the two fellas in the bookies. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a funny story, but it epitomizes what people actually thought at the time. So Gusty Spence was seen by many people in his own age group and older as somebody who had travelled the world because he was in the army. And so he went into the bookies in the Shankill one day. It was in '60, so they were legal at the time because they were made legal in 1960, I think. Anyway, so Gusty goes into the bookies and these two boys were having an argument, and they were arguing about who owned Australia. And, so one of them says, "Oh, well, ask Gusty, he know who owns Australia?" So he turns around and he says to Gusty, "Don't we own Australia?" And Gusty says, "We do, but you don't have a nurse in your trousers."
Yeah.
And one of them got it and the other one didn't. But the point was, like, it doesn't matter what's in the British Empire and who owns it, but at the end of the day, we don't benefit from it in that sense. And that was sort of the moral of the story. But I was told that one guy half got it, the other guy didn't get it at all. Everybody else laughed. It was in the bookies at the time. So it's those sorts of stories, and when you hear that, it brings home what people actually, thought, that they owned it rather than it was owned by, the British government or whoever.
I suppose that diverges nicely, because when you're looking at that period and talking about the end of the empire and, the perceptions on the Shankill, when you talk about Gusty having been in Cyprus and Aden or whatever, and how he can bring that experience. But at the same time, 1966, you're only 10 years old at the time. Like a lot of people who would go on to become embroiled in the conflict in the 70s. But Gusty obviously becomes central in that 1966 period as one of the, the UVF emerge on the scene in the Malvern Street shooting. So what, I mean, I know you were only 10 at the time, but can you talk a wee bit about what the feeling was in the Shankill when these guys were arrested for what was murder, and, how people felt about the UVF and Gusty Spence at that time? Yeah,
well, I think there had been talk about what was going on. There had been shootings in the Old Park about the IRA. Again, if you remember, like in '66, it would have been 50 years from Easter Rising and stuff like that. So, all that tension was about. It was also 50 years from the Battle of the Somme as well. So the tensions were about, and there was all this discussion about the growth of the IRA, and particularly in cases like Ardoyne and things like that. So there was all of that. And so there had been a number of shootings around that time. And I think that was the first time, I suppose. I was too young to understand what was going on at the time, but for me, it was like my granny lived around the corner from where the shooting happened. So I had to walk past it to get to my granny's and walk past it to get back home again. So it was there. For me at that particular time, I suppose the tensions were there, but for me, it was about writing on the wall. And, the things that were being written on the wall was like UVF and, anti-IRA stuff. So that was what was happening. And for me, didn't really understand it, but you could feel that that the area was tense and stuff, and you knew something was going on. So from that point of view, lots of people in the Shankill were sort of listening to this, and I don't know who was talking about it, but in a sense of who created all of that. But the talk had been created that the IRA were ready to sort of arm up because it was 50 years and that there was going to be another rising and they were going to start killing people and stuff like that. So obviously at that time, sort of like didn't really know what was going on, but I knew that there was tension. I could feel it. I could hear adults talking about it. And in those days, old boys, well, they were old boys to me, like, but when you're 10, they're old boys, but they were probably in their 30s or 20s. But they all used to stand the corners and they all talked. And they all told stories, and they were stories. You found that out later that there were stories, but at the time you thought that they were telling you, what was happening in life, and this was true. And it was like, watching the news when it wasn't really. Well, maybe it is like watching the news now when you get all this fake news. But anyway, it was around that sort of stuff. It was very tense, and the rumours were rife. And as kids, we didn't really understand it, but we knew something was going on and it wasn't sort of right, if you know what I mean.
I suppose the interesting thing at that period, just to sort of tie up the 1960s, I mean, you talk about that attitude in the Schenkel and the idea of the empire and what was happening with the UVF. The interesting thing you said to me was that you think you were a product of a mixed marriage, because on the one hand, although your parents were both Protestants, your mother was quite a staunch unionist, and on the other hand, your dad was worked with Catholics and was a bookmaker. And, you know, the thing that touches upon the stuff going on behind the scenes, I think it was your father said that Paisley would fight to the last drop of someone else's blood. So can you talk a wee bit about the different attitudes in the household?
Yeah, my mother was staunch. My mother was staunch unionist and came from a type of family, and people had fought the Somme and other places as well, not just the Somme but other places. So her relatives would have been on that. My father was very staunch in terms of that he didn't like Paisley. He was anti-Paisley. He always would have voted Jerry Flitt because he didn't believe in what was going on. So I didn't really understand this at the time, but they used to talk. I heard people talking about key money, including soldiers who came back from conflicts and they had to pay key money. But I remember this. I never knew what it was, but I understand it now. But I remember my mother saying something about she was going to go and see some unions and she was going to pay the key money. And he says, "No, you're not." And she says, "Why?" And he says, "Because when you pay key money, it just gets you slum quicker." And there were things that I didn't understand, but later in life I started to understand. And so he was always opposed there. And it was in, I think it was 66 or 67, I can't remember. But anyway, they're opening the arch, and they had an arch in Brussels Street, was around the corner from me on the Shangle. And they were actually had invited Paisley to open it. And he said to me, "Don't you even round there?" And I said, "Tonight." And I says, "Why? What's wrong?" He says, "Just want you to stay away." And it was the first time I heard the term demagogue, and I didn't know what it meant, right? So I'm only 10, maybe 11 at the time. I hadn't a clue what a demagogue was. But anyway, that was a term my father used. He's a demagogue, nobody can near him, and he'd fight the last drop of everybody else's blood. So, I mean, it was that sort of stuff. And I was never a Paisley. I didn't buy into what Paisley was saying and stuff like that. But, it was there. And it was funny that later on that those were the sorts of things I heard in my head that my father had said to me. And the thing about it is, there were Catholics who lived in the Shangle, and I would have known a number of Catholics. And I don't mean like 2 dozen or anything, but I knew about a dozen Catholics who lived in the Shangle, and everybody lived fine. But I think about then, I think it. People were afraid to actually talk about where they were going and what they were doing because of all of that. And I think when Paisley came, it made it even worse in terms of how people felt. And I'm sure people felt uncomfortable with it. Quite a lot of them would have been mixed marriages, and others wouldn't have been. They'd have just been Catholics who were living there. So I think that's what sort of the tensions grew. So some of the the children of the Catholic families that we were running about, we were okay about it. But they didn't talk as openly as they did previous to then. And when I say talk openly about what they did, where they went, and stuff like that, and I think if they were going to chapel, obviously they weren't going to tell people, and that would have been a problem. And you could see they closed up and things like that. They went to Protestant schools. They didn't go to Catholic schools. They went to Protestant schools. So all of those things, but they just kept quiet if they were going to see their aunt in Ardoyne or wherever. They wouldn't have talked about it, whereas it was open before then. So people just kept quiet about it and didn't really want to talk about it because it drew attention to them, I think. But that's the way it was, and I think those sorts of things were happening. The problem for unionists was that unionists continually went on the way they did in terms of those who were elected till Stormont. And the difficulty with that was that they couldn't see that the empire was disappearing, and they continually tried to rule and live as if we were in the empire when we weren't.
Well, I suppose then when you come on to, you're turned 15 in 1970, started in 1971, just after Christmas. You're 15. So that things have changed quite dramatically then in terms of the security situation. And there's a lot of, I suppose there's a lot of fear across Northern Ireland, but in places like the Shankill, Ardoyne, across Belfast, and in places like Derry, it's very intense. So at that period, you're following Linfield around the country and you're getting involved in the tartan gangs and that type of thing. How did that sort of raise your awareness of what was going on, and how did it intensify your feelings about the emerging conflict?
Well, I mean, I suppose in many ways it didn't matter, what community you come from. So I'm just talking about the Loyalist community because that's where I lived. I mean, lots of tensions, particularly around that particular time, bombs going off, no warning bombs, people being killed, and people being shot at, and so you had all of that, and so from my point of view, it was becoming difficult, and it was becoming difficult in the sense that it didn't look like anybody was doing anything about it. So it didn't look like the British government were going to do anything about it. It didn't look like Stormont were interested in doing anything about it. It was very difficult in terms of what was going on in the street and what you were seeing. So for me, and this, but for me, two things that probably affected me most was the bomb in the Balmore showroom in Shankill, where the leisure centre is now. And whenever it went off that day, I wasn't that far away, and we run down the scene. People have been killed, and there was an 18-month-old baby who was put into a plastic bag, just at Slims and stuff like that. And at that time, I didn't know, but I knew the mother and the father. I knew of them, and it was that sort of stuff. And there was a Catholic killed in the bomb. There was a 18-month-old baby. There was a 5-year-old boy as well, I think. So it was just all of that, and and then when the sort of rumor mill starts, it gets worse in terms of there's an hour bomb up a shank, all that sort of stuff. So it was very tense at the time. People didn't know what to do. They didn't feel protected, and they felt quite vulnerable. And I suppose in many ways that's why you get the emergence of an organisation like the UDA, which was a vigilante group to start with, and then turned into the UDA. And then on the other side, you had the IRA, and so when you have those two sort of things, going on in society, it's a powder keg, and nobody seemed to be able to control it. Neither the security forces, or anybody else, and it was just going on. But from my point of view, I think that there is no doubt in the Shankill at that particular time, the tension, you could feel it. It was there. And lots of people were actually talking about it by then. And the other bomb was, I was coming back from a Linfield match, and the bomb went off in the 4-step inn at the time, and 2 pensioners were killed. Now these 2 pensioners were sort of characters, everybody knew them, and whenever they were killed, so people knew who they were and stuff like that, and they were very well liked because they were characters. Everybody, doesn't matter where it's a Falls or Shankill, there was always characters about, and everybody knew who they were. So from that point of view, those were the 2 bombs. It was very difficult because it was, from one age and then going to the other, and it was no warning. They were both no warning bombs and stuff like that. So it was difficult at that particular time, and tensions were growing. So it was very difficult to deal with.
I think one of the things that will strike people, particularly people who didn't live through that period, people who are younger, or people even who did live through the period, but had a more middle class existence and were sort of protected from it, will be astonished that I know William Mitchell did his PhD, and he found that the average age of young fellas who were involved was 18 and a half. But it's astonishing when you look at, you were 16 at that stage, well, about to become 16 at the end of 1971. And it was around that time you were planning your own sort of response to what you saw going on around you. And it wasn't the tartan gang anymore. It was more in terms of paramilitary action. So, since the book's come out, a few people have remarked to me that, if this was in this day and age, you'd quite rightly called a child soldier. So what looking back, I mean, is it astonishing to you to think that you were involved in this sort of culture as a 15, 16-year-old and that you were forming your own paramilitary organization, or is it just part of your life that you look back on and see it as just an organic progression?
No, I've had those conversations, but the first thing I want to say, because I think this is important, in 1966, when Gusty Spence and the others went into prison, there were 2 life sentence prisoners before they got there. And if we go to 76, there was thousands of young loyalists and young Republicans who were already in the prisons, and quite a lot of them were serving life. And I think for people to tell me that everybody was a psychopath, it's nonsense, because you don't create psychopaths. For me, society didn't deal with the issues, and they allowed this conflict to happen. And so, from that point of view, it's not an excuse; it's a reason. And what I'm saying is, like, if you look at how many people ended up in the prisons, particularly doing life, and their age brackets, quite a lot of them were very young when they started out, and they ended up there. But so the prison system had 2 lifers in '66 whenever Gusty Spence went in. One of them was a paedophile who had what he did happened on the Ormer Road, and the other one was a guy who was in for murdering his mother-in-law. And they were the 2 lifers in Northern Ireland. So when you think about how the Troubles went and how many people were in prison and how many people did life, it needs to be explained away. And my former colleague and late David Irvine actually said one time that whenever he was asked about the Troubles and what happened, and he says, well, what came first, the politics or the paramilitaries? And people need to answer that question for themselves. But no, so yes, there were times, I mean, I think, so in the book I tell the story about being at school, and there'd been riots all weekend, and there'd been riots against one of the parachute regiments, and they were involved in the riots. They came in, but before then, the King's Own, they were a Liverpool regiment, and there'd been riots in Shangle. And I had been orchestrating the riots. I had got up and took a flag down that belonged to the regimental flag. I took it off the bunker that they were in. So they came looking for me. Not only did that happen, but anyway, there was a gateway, and the gateway was kicked open. I ran down the gateway, and soldier fired a tear gas canister. It hit the ground and bounced up and hit me in the eye, and it cut my sort of eye open. It's still a scar where it hit me. And there was 2 girls about my age who pulled me out and got me out of it. And so anyway, I was coming home from school on a bus, and this local guy called J.P. Kane, who was the character, same age as me, roughly, maybe a year younger or something. But he came in, he got on the bus and told me that 2 stops down that the army and the police were waiting, and it was for me. And I says, how do you know? And he says, I heard them talking, and they were waiting on you. So anyway, I got off the bus, and I can remember sort of walking up Crimea Street, and when I was walking up, I just went, like, what am I doing? What's going on here in terms of all of this? Because, like, I'm a kid, and I've got these people looking for me, and people are coming to me and saying, we need to do this or we need to do that. So, like, and I asked myself a question and went, like, somebody my age at the time, I think I was maybe 14 or 15, and I was going, like, somebody my age should be doing something else like this. But anyway, it came into my head, and I think from that day on, I sort of took a conscious decision that I was in. I believed in what I was doing, and I was going to have to continue. There was no way out. And I didn't sort of, like, all of those things I did, and I did them sort of, like, how would I describe it? There were just things that I did in terms of organising stuff like that. It wasn't something that I'd ever been trained to do, but it was something that other people looked to me to do as well. And quite a lot of other people were just like me and sort of, fell into all this and were able to do it. But it was sort of the questions I had to ask myself was, what should a 14 or a 15-year-old be doing today? Like, rather than actually trying to get home, get out of a school uniform and sort of hide away from, soldiers who were waiting on them. So anyway, that's what happened, and they eventually tracked me down, but they couldn't pin anything on me because any photographs they had, I was wearing, it was a handkerchief, but they called it a mask. but it was a face covering, I would call it, in modern day terms. But no, and that's the way it was. And so from that point of view, you started thinking like an adult as a a 15 or 16-year-old, and you had to make decisions. And those decisions were never easy to make, but you had to make them.
And that's what I found interesting, and I'm sure a lot of other people on that subject of basically being a child and being involved in this type of thing, or a young teenager. You and your friends are at this stage in 1971, 72, you haven't turned 17 yet, and you're going around Northern Ireland recruiting people into an organisation with your friends and trying to promote the the message of the YTV at that stage. I mean, looking back now, do you have any insight into how that felt, or what it looks like now from a distance of 50 odd years?
Well, I suppose in many ways, Gareth, I had to grow up. I had to grow up very, very quickly, because as you say, like, it wasn't just sort of going around and recruiting people. There were people who were coming to me, looking for help in terms of where we get weapons, all that sort of stuff. So that was going on as well. Like, and I was going like, what do you say to these people? And I suppose in many ways, and I don't know what it is. I don't know why it's my personality. I don't know what it was, but it just seemed to be that people just came from nowhere and come to me and said to me, "Well, we can help you with X, Y, and Z." And I'm going, "Do you not want to talk to somebody else?" And they're going, "No." And I was put into a position, and I've carried this through my life, where one guy who was talking to me and said he wouldn't talk to anybody else, and he was able to give me information and help me with stuff that I wouldn't do it for anybody else. So I don't know what it was, and the more of that happens to you, I think you just get caught up in it and you just keep going. But look, listen, I always wanted to do it because I thought that there was no alternative. So it's not a question of that I didn't want to do it. I did, but you have to grow up very quickly, and you have to start plotting and planning, because if you don't, and the first thing that I learned was that you can't do this in terms of being involved in a paramilitary organisation or being involved in troubles. You can't do it if you don't have some sort of mechanism to help you, because the things that you're involved in would drive you mad. It would make you, and I know people who just couldn't cope with it, people who took nervous breakdowns, all that sort of stuff. And so it's about how you actually start to sort of help yourself to cope with things, how you actually justify them. I can't justify them to others, but I can justify them to myself to keep me sane. But I could never justify some of the things that was going on in this country, and I wouldn't even try to, because you just can't do it. It's a question of how do you prepare yourself to do it. I mean, I suppose in many ways it's like anybody in life, whatever they do, you have to have a plan. And if you don't have a plan, it's like that thing where, can't remember who said it, but it was said by somebody famous. And I'm not talking about a footballer because he used it after, but it's like, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And we remember Roy King said that when he went to Japan for the World Cup, he had the row with, can't remember the manager's name, but anyway, Mick McCarthy. So, but the point about it was he said that, but it was said by somebody very famous at the time. I'm not sure who it was, but it was said by somebody very famous. And so it is about that. If you don't plan what you're going to do, then you'll fail. And no matter what you do in life, and you need to do it. But it's very difficult. And I'm not going to sit here and say it wasn't. But to do what you do, you just have to prepare yourself for it, because it's difficult.
Yeah, I'm thinking here. The book's called My Life in Loyalism, so it is increasingly at this period of time, your life is intertwined with loyalism and the response to what's going on in Northern Ireland at the time. So in terms of that period, one of the things people have remarked about in the book is that they've been introduced to a lot of different characters who they'd never heard of, or they'd heard of but they didn't know anything about. And I've written down a few names here, like Jim McDonald, Billy Mitchell, Tommy West, Jim Hanna, Frenchie Marchant. Can you give us an insight into the sort of people that we know about, and what your feelings are about their contribution to what was going on at that time, and your relationships with them?
Yeah, listen, everybody will have a different view of people, right? You know, and so the people that I met, those sorts of people like Frenchy Martin and Jim Hanna, and I know that he was shot dead with UV for being an informer. I never believed it. I couldn't see where the evidence was. I think people didn't like him because he was probably, he had gathered a momentum and he had a lot of people with him, so people say he was a threat. I suppose in many ways I was getting there if I wasn't already, only I went to prison and sort of survived it. But I mean, I think other people would have been sort of worried about where I was going with what I was doing and how much support I had from people. And, so, at a very young age, I was sitting talking to these people and we were agreeing around meetings about what should happen and stuff like that. And, so that's what was going on. They didn't know what age I was. They thought I was 8 years older than I really was. So they thought I was in the 20s, maybe like 30 years younger than them. I wasn't. I was 17, 18 at the time. But, and it's that sort of stuff. So you're sitting down with a group of men and you suddenly find yourself saying, no, you can't do that. So to give you an example, they were all sitting around the table and we had this guy who was at the table and he started talking about how he came in and he says, look, I'm going to be the new operations officer. And I says, what's a new operations officer? And everybody looked at me. And I says, do you mean that you're going to tell us what we can do and what we can't do? And we have to justify everything to you? He says, yeah. And I says, well, not be happening. And everybody just looked at me. I says, I'll not be doing it. He says, why? And I says, because people have to be protected. I said, so anybody who, when you're talking about an operation, anybody who goes out are the only people who know, and maybe one or two others know. And I said, so that's it, it won't be happening. And he says, you'll do what we say. And he says, no, you won't. We're not doing it. He said, so anyway, he left the room and everybody else said to me, what are you going to do? I said, what do you mean, what are you going to do? I said, it's a paramilitary organisation. He says, there's no votes in this organisation. You don't get a vote. And he said, well, he's talking about having a vote in brigade staff. I said, well, that's okay, it'll not be happening. So he said to me, well, what do you do? So I'd said to Frenchy Martin and said a couple of other people. I says, I'm going to go and see brigade staff and ask them what they're going to do. So at that time, Billy Mitchell was on brigade staff, and Billy Mitchell was how would I describe it? He was very intelligent and very astute. Billy always needed somebody to back him. He never ever had the confidence, you know what I mean, to do things on his own. He needed somebody to give him that sort of thing. So I said, tell him that, listen, I'll go and talk to them. So I went and met the 5 members of brigade staff individually and spoke to them all. And I says, he's going to have a vote. And they went, what do you mean? I says, oh, that's operations officer. And he said to me, probably. And I says, well, what way are you going to vote? So 3 of them said to me they were going to vote for it, and the other 2 said they weren't. So I said, that's okay. I said, how are you going to explain it to the rest of us? And he says, oh, we'll call a meeting. They said, that's fair enough. So they called the meeting anyway, and whenever we went, the vote lost 3-2. So brigade staff changed their minds. And I don't know who helped them change their minds, but I was very clear that we weren't going to accept it, and it was supported by everybody else. So they changed their minds, and I think the reason why the 3 voted for it or against it was because they knew that's how they survived, and the other 2 didn't survive because they voted for it. So it's that sort of stuff, and it's about it's brinkmanship, it's all of those things, and it's about how you do it. So I mean, that's what so people said to me, or thought maybe that I convinced the 3 of them to go to give me a majority vote. I just said, I want to know how you're voting. And when they told me, I said, well, I agree or disagree with it. But anyway, we got one who turned over and it didn't happen. But, it was interesting, because the person who was going to be operations officer disappeared. And he didn't disappear by any foul means. He disappeared by being taken away by British intelligence because he was an agent.
Yeah. Well, because, I mean, obviously that year, 1974, is the year, when you're eventually convicted for murder and you go to long cash. But one of the things I've noticed, and we've talked about this before, in that sort of period leading up to 74, is in the newspaper, I mean, the reviews for the book have generally been pretty good, but some of the criticisms have been, I'll just list here, you didn't talk about the UWC strike, you didn't talk about the Dublin and Monaghan bombs, you didn't talk about the Schenkel butchers, you didn't talk about the Miami show band. So can you explain why we didn't address any of those things, just for people who are curious?
Well, as I said, I suppose at the very start, the book is about the Troubles, but it's not about the Troubles in a sense. It's about my life and loyalism, and all of those things you mentioned. I was in prison, so I wasn't involved in all of those. I was in prison, so anything I know about them is hearsay, or what I read in a newspaper, or it's hearsay. So there is no point in me getting into discussions about that. I can get into discussions, as just said there, about we get staff calling the meeting, and about what I did, and it's in the book. I mean, very clearly, sort of, I was in control of that. I was in control of who was in the room in terms of anybody, But it was bloodless. So like it was a velvet revolution, and it fell and went. And anyway, it was sorted out. But the point I'm making here is that I'm not going to write stories about what I don't have firm knowledge of. Now, some people from that period, or some people from the period when I was in prison, when I talk about things, might see it differently. But sure, if it was four of us standing at a corner, as an accident happened, we probably would have three different descriptions of how the accident happened. So that's how life is, and we all live history. But the difficulty is that for me is, that was another reason for writing the book. Most people who write history weren't there at the time and have to go on what they can find. We were there, and I think it was important that I told the story about my life and loyalism, and that's why I chose that story. So it was quite simple. The other stories that people have criticised me for not talking about, I don't know anything about them, and so therefore can't talk about them.
Yeah, and I mean, I think those topics are maybe more for somebody who's doing a history of the UVF, like Ian Turner.
But the example is, I was criticised because I told a story, and I think this is a good story. Well, it's not a good story, but it's a way to explain this. So in 1972, I was standing in the Shangle, and it was a Saturday morning, and Nanny Murphy was coming down, and Nanny Murphy stopped to talk to me, who I knew at that time, obviously, and he started talking to me, and I was with two guys, and we were standing and talking, and we weren't talking about the UVF or anything else. But the next thing is, the Land Rovers all pulled up, and out jumped the army, and the police were with them, and they arrested me, and they took me away. They took me to Springfield Road Police Station, and when they brought me in, they said to me, is your pseudonym Captain Henry, what was it? Captain Henry, I can't remember the name, but it was Captain Henry, so it's in the book. Yeah. And I said no on that. And they said to me, oh, you were in Argyle Street last night. What were you doing on Argyle Street? And I says, well, I was in Argyle Street with a young lad whose aunt was sick, and he asked me to take him to the house just for 5 minutes to see her, and I did. And they said, no, you weren't. And I says, what do you mean I wasn't? They said, you were looking for Captain William Johnson. And I said, what? They said, you were looking for Captain William Johnson. And I says, I don't even know who Captain William Johnson is. He says, you're telling lies. I says, I don't. And he said to me, the police said to me, how do you not know who he is? And I says, because it's a pseudonym. How would I know who he is? He said, it could be anybody. But anyway, I know for a fact at that time, Captain William Johnson didn't play in Kern. He didn't live in Ernie Street. But they were saying that I was going to murder Captain William Johnson and take over, which was a lot of nonsense. But anyway, that's what I was arrested for. They let me go, I think, 3 hours later, and I come back in the Shangle. And anyway, the word got to me that Lenny was unhappy that they didn't arrest him. And I'd said to Lenny, you're the one that arrested for this. I said, it's just a lot of nonsense. And by the way, if you were going to pin this on you, like I said, you'd be in real trouble, because it would mean that you're an adjutant who was going to overthrow another one and all the rest of it. So anyway, and that's how I knew Lenny. I knew Lenny very well at that particular time, but I was criticised because I didn't say in the book he went on to be a Shangle butcher. My context in that book was 1972, not after it. So I didn't mention him being a Shangle butcher. I mentioned Lenny as I knew him, what we were talking about. I just think that confuses the book if you start talking about, everybody will know that, because Murphy would have been infamous and they would have known he became a Shangle butcher. But the problem was, for me in the book, I never even thought of describing them like that, because that's not the context I was talking to him. And I was talking to somebody in the context of 1972 and the Shangle Butchers hadn't happened. So it's those wee silly things that people pick up on, and that when we wrote the book, we weren't going to say, at a period in time, we try to stick to a period in time, so we weren't going to say such and such, ended up doing that or doing this. I wasn't there, and I don't know the full involvement of what happened in the Butchers, except for what I read in the papers at the time and saw on television.
Yeah. So something you can talk about, obviously, is when you're incarcerated in Long Kesh and you meet up with Gusty Spence again, and I think education became a big thing. And one of the interesting things when we were putting the book together is that you were able to get access to your prison record from the Public Record Office. And obviously there's some letters in that file where you're writing to the Northern Ireland office and the governor complaining that you aren't getting facilities for your Open University course. So can you talk a wee bit about, how important education was, and also how important it is to have records like that, still in the public domain that you can access and sort of fill in some of the blanks from your own history?
Yeah, look, the compound system was a totally different system than anywhere else in the world. It was, it was just different. And the reason for that was that it was like Stalag 17, and if anybody isn't old enough to remember those films, they were in black and white, I think. But anyway, it's the way it is. It's like a prison camp, so they're Nissen huts. And they're inside a compound, and people's housed in them. The prison officers walk around the compound, and they go in and do patrols and make sure everything's all right. One of the things that actually happened was the way Gusty had set this up, along with other IRA commanders, particularly Provisional IRA, the official IRA, UDA, and Gusty had set this up, and they had what was called the Camp Council. So the governors agreed with them that they were going to do different things. So Gusty argued about education and fitness. So it was always about how you kept yourself fit, sort of, in terms of your heart and lungs, but also how you kept your brain active. And that's what he always, and he also encouraged people to do handicrafts and stuff like that, just to keep themselves active. And people that played football and did all sorts of things, volleyball, all that sort of stuff. And people were keeping themselves fit doing that, and walking, running. So they were doing all of that. So education was an important part of all of this. And actually, I just texted somebody this morning who texted me about the book and said to me about, and I said to him, that's not how it was. People decided whether they was on education or not, and you could do formal or informal education. And that was, that was the thing about it. So from that point of view, I can remember asking the education officer, saying to him that I wanted to study Soviet history. And he said to me, right, okay, I'll put the request in. So he put the request in, and they came back and says, no, you can't. And so I said, well, why can I not study Soviet history? And he said to me, well, you need an A in English and an A in Maths, or a B in Maths to actually do that. And I says, why would that be? I says, who else has been asked to do this? So I asked the education officer. He says, nobody. I said, so people doing the Open University has to do A levels, all this sort of stuff, or do O levels or whatever. But anyway, they wouldn't let me do it. So I decided that I was going to do an A level, or I was going to do an O level in English and an O level in Maths. And I got an A and a B. So they couldn't stop me, because my view was, I'm not going to let them stop me. But by this stage, there was a guy in the next compound, and he was official IRA man. We called him Pumpy, because he used to stay on all day. Well, he didn't stay on all day, because obviously he was doing university, he was doing a degree in social science. So he was kicking the ball against the wire, and we were walking around. There was about a road's distance between us, so you know physical contact. But anyway, he said to me one day, here, are you doing the Open University? And I went, no. And he says to me, why? I says, I'm not, I'm doing an O level in English and Maths, why? And he says, no. He says, if I give you a couple of books to read. Would you do an assignment and I'll get my tutor in the market for you? I says, what would you want me to do that for? He says, well, just to see, it might give you a bit of confidence to do it. So I said to him, yeah, give it to the prison officer, and he gave it to me. So the prison officer got it and he walked over and he gave it to me. And I said, I'll have a look at this. So I actually read the book, and after I read a couple of every units, like what they were booked for. And I says, oh, okay, I'll do it. And I said, right, I'll do this essay. So I did the essay. And I says, now how am I going to give it to you? And I says, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll open it and give it to them, because if they read it, it doesn't really matter. It's not. So anyway, cut a long story short, I gave him the essay, and the next thing was the tutor was in the education thing, and she'd asked the prison officer, could she talk to me? So he brought her over to the compound, and she was talking to me through the wire. And I said to her, hello, how are you? And she says, right, okay. She says, there's your essay back. And I says, did it do all right? She says, well, I give you a B+. She says, do you want to sign up for Open University? I says, oh, that me. And she says, what do you mean, no, that? I says, I have to have an O-level. 2 O-levels, one in English and one in maths. She says, that's nonsense. And I says, I'm doing it now anyway. I set the exam in a couple of weeks or whatever it was. So I sat them out and got them. So they couldn't refuse me from doing it. But that was just it. Everything that I tried to do, they were blocking it. But they were doing it with everybody else, but they didn't put those sorts of restrictions on it. So anyway, I did the Open University. So I studied social sciences, and then after that I did a postgraduate diploma in town planning, because that's what I wanted to do.
And I think that's the important thing about what the Public Record Office does. You know, you were able to access your file, and there was supporting evidence for what you just said there. The obstacles that were put in your place, and the sort of bureaucracy that the prison tried to put in front of you so that you couldn't get that education. So there's a paper trail there, and that's one of the important things about the preservation of records and documents as well.
Yeah.
But to go on to another thing, you know, and we're coming towards the end here. One of the things I was looking at there recently was, you know, the work that Ernie O'Malley did around the time of the War of Independence. And he was obviously one of the commanders in the Irish Republican Army. And he was able to, in the 1940s, he was able to do a sort of oral history of people who had been involved alongside him in the War of Independence. And he was able to make notes and do interviews with these people. Now, in the current scenario with the Boston College and the controversy around that, and prosecutions arising from it, because I'm thinking about how you marry together the archival material that's in the Public Record Office with oral history, and I'm thinking about the prison's memory archive. How difficult or easy do you think it is to tell stories as authentically as possible about the Troubles, and about you, not specifically your involvement, but generally people's involvement in what went on? Well,
you can't. Well, I suppose I did it in the book, and I'll have to see what happens. But you know, it's nearly impossible to do on the basis that once you say anything, then everybody comes down on top of you. You know, that's why, you know, when people talk about truth commissions and all, they'll never happen. One is that most of the people in my age bracket are dead, you know, or very ill, you know, and you just every week you hear about somebody else down and all the rest of it. So all of that's going with people who would have had that information. But, you know, the Boston tapes was a classic example of how that happened. Now, people were told, I was one of the ones who did. I did 11 tapes in the Boston tapes, and I was told by the people who was organising it, and they were asked the question, can the police get these? And they went, no, you're protected by American law. It never happened. You know, they gave them over to the police, any ones that they wanted. I had already got mine back, and they were destroyed because of it. That, you know, I thought that it would have been good archive for people to listen to and stuff, but that's never the way it happened. But I still get involved because the prison memory stuff at PRONI, I've got involved in that because I think it's important. It's important for people to actually do this, because I think that this oral history thing is good. I think it's great that people do it, and I would hope that more people would do it. But you know, now you need to be careful what you talk about or what you say, because that you can be incriminated, you know, and you end up with the police at your door, and then you get sentenced or took back to prison, and that's always a difficulty. So, but no, and I think it's a shame because, you know, the whole oral history in this country, no matter who's talking about it, is very, very important. And I think that, you know, that's, you know, that oral history is coming from people who lived through the Troubles, or people, maybe even people who were affected by it, you know, and, you know, became victims in terms of their mother or whatever, their parents being killed or whatever. And I think it's important to hear from many of the victims as well. But you know, difficulty with that is that, so if people come out and talk about it, they need to remember when you're talking about things, there are victims in society, and you need to be careful how that is handled by people whenever you start talking about things. But no, it's a shame that the Boston tapes failed in the way it did, and there would have been lots of great stories to be heard, but it's not going to happen. I think if people don't go. So if somebody come to me now and said to me, like, listen, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, I would say to them, don't keep your head down, don't bother, because once you put your head above the parapet, you just become a target. You become a target for the media, you become a target for everybody else, and people just want to criticize you. So it's going to be very, very hard, and it's just a shame. I know that Belfast City Council has a project where they want to do this living history thing as well, and they want to sort of have it in the white bank at the bottom of North Street and things like that. And I hope it succeeds. And we need to have all voices in it, and people will tell their stories the way they remember it. I just think we need to watch it. We don't sanitize it. You know, so I think that people should be allowed to talk about it, no matter what background they're from, in terms of. But it would be good to hear all the voices in the policemen, soldiers, victims, you know, paramilitaries. All of that would be great to hear.
Well, that's everything at my end. Billy, is there anything you want to add before we open the thing to questions? Or
no, I think people have listened long enough, so let's get questions.
Okay, thanks.